The month of Halloween horror continues. Do you have the right tools to survive? Silver bullets, holy water, Fido keys? You'll need to keep yourself safe from zombie bites. You'll need to keep your memory safe from gnoll bites. So as you take your evening stroll through the graveyard, be careful, because some things just aren't ready to rust in peace. Which means this week we talk with Tom Gibson from Cloudsmith about what an SBOM can really tell you and why it's important for your organization. In the news segment, Twitch is haunted by a breach. Apache revives the slasher genre. Microsoft disables a macro cosmic horror, and more. Board up the windows and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Whether you need to manage bots, protect cloud applications at runtime, stop form jacking attacks, or secure your web applications and APIs, only Imperva offers a unified solution to protect from edge to application and data in one tool. Imperva helps you achieve more, save money, and become more efficient with fewer security vendors needed. Start a free trial today to easily protect your apps and website with Imperva. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Imperva. Is your mobile app really secure? New vulnerabilities pop up every day, and malicious actors look for easy targets on app marketplaces to exploit. Securing your app's valuable IP and data is critical. GuardSquare security solutions are built for developers and protect your app at every stage in the development lifecycle. Multiple layers of protection prevent reverse engineering and automatically detect tampering, making your app a difficult target for attackers. Learn more at securityweekly.com/GuardSquare. We discuss application security a lot on this show, and we know that the implications for code security have become even greater as cloud adoption accelerates software development. Shift Left bridges the gap between security teams and developers to find and fix vulnerabilities accurately from the source. Shift Left Core is an innovation in code security with industry-leading accuracy and speed. It combines next-generation static code analysis, intelligent software composition analysis, secrets detection, security insights, and contextual developer security education in one easy-to-use platform. Learn more and create your free account at securityweekly.com/shiftleft.
This is episode 169, recorded October 11th, 2021. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here, as always, with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Hey, man. Johnny just faded out our background music. I was just sort of getting into it. Happy Monday.
Happy Monday, John. And John, if you, like any of our listeners, don't want to miss out on your favorite Security Weekly content, you can visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe on any of our podcast feeds and have all new episodes downloaded right to your phone. You can also join our mailing list, Discord server, and follow us on social media and our streaming platforms. And all of the above gives you a chance to bop along to our theme music with John. In other news, Security Weekly Unlocked will be held in person this December 5th through 7th at the Hilton Lake Buena Vista. We'll have keynotes from Alyssa Miller, John Strand, Leslie Carhart, and Dave Kennedy. Visit securityweekly.com/unlocked to register and check out our exciting lineup. With over 10 years in the worlds of DevOps and FinTech, Tom is currently a senior staff engineer at Cloudsmith, where he helps lead and develop the product and platform. As an automation and security enthusiast, Tom is incredibly passionate about helping people and organizations implement and adopt technologies and processes that help secure their software supply chain. When he's not busy with computers, you can find him watching the latest reality dating TV show, building Legos, or doing his 500th home improvement project. Hello, Tom. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Mike. Thanks so much for that. Great to be here today. Really looking forward to our discussion.
Well, we're definitely looking forward to a discussion and for you taking time out of those home improvement projects, which I suspect is also reading a lot of, well, maybe there's 500 because you haven't been reading as many instructions perhaps, or trying to make sure you have all the materials, which I think sets us up for a discussion about software bills of materials. And, I kind of alluded to this at the beginning that, they're important. They're part of the supply chain. We've been talking about them, us as well as the industry, ever since, of course, that infamous compromise over December, but they're pretty important. So long rambling intro aside, help us set up a little bit maybe of what we should, how we should position the idea of SBOM into the supply chain, and we'll kind of unfold things from there.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I guess we'll take a start. I always like to start this whole thing with a bit of an analogy to the hardware industry, an industry that has gotten this right for a very long time for the most part. And it's the concept of being aware of the content of an application. So the dependencies that make up that application. We are increasingly in a world where applications are decomposed of many different third-party application pieces and segments, as well as internal home-written pieces as well. And it's about maintaining a list of all of those pieces for the purposes of, well, a variety of reasons, ultimately. For legal folk, you're able to present a list of licensing requirements to assert that you're conforming to legal requirements in certain regions. But, predominantly it's about having assurance that you're safe, essentially, that your components that you're bringing into your application stack are vetted. They're as free of vulnerabilities as possibly can be, and that they do what they say ultimately. And it's about having that level of certainty. And I mentioned about sort of alluding a little bit to the hardware realm of that. And the concept is not new for there. If I don't have it with me right now, but if I was to show, a phone, an iPhone, an Android phone, whatever it happens to be, the components of that device are made up of a bunch of different things. I don't know them all, but you can be sure that the manufacturer does. They'll have an approved list of vendors, so sources that sources that pieces of the actual product can come from, as well as who are trusted to actually provide them and ultimately what go into the end product as a whole. And so SBOM is kind of like applying those sorts of concepts, but to the software world. And there's been, as you previously sort of mentioned here, Mike, there has most certainly been an emphasis on this as a piece of importance, certainly in recent times with the various attacks that we've seen recently, SolarWinds being a great example of something that probably kicked off a whole initiative. It's not new, but I think it's been revitalized, and we're starting to see renewed efforts across the board from various organizations that are really trying to strengthen in on the bill of materials and the software side.
Indeed. And to me, it falls into that category of just improving visibility, observability of just what software are we deploying into prod? What are we consuming? And you really highlighted that in the aspect of that, in the sense that SBOM is just telling us what's in the tin, what are we using? And I think, and I know you weren't making this point, and one of the things I want to get in front of too is that SBOM doesn't magically protect us from 0 days. It's not that type of preventative measure, but what it does enable us to say, when a vulnerability is identified, a vulnerability is announced, we can say, is this going to affect us? And hopefully we can go back and point to this package, this other package are what we need to now go and immediately update, rather than scratching our head, hoping we have some other long-winded way of trying to find, are we exposed to this? So that's where I want to pull in some of the vulnerability scanning, perhaps, or maybe just the vulnerability handling aspect of this, because one is the known vulns, but SBOM is, I think, also about provenance and a bit of quality assurance. So how do these different factors play into what perhaps an SBOM can represent for an organization, and help us have that confidence in the software that we're using?
Sure. Well, a great point to start talking about provenance. It's you're right. It's a key part of the whole concept and philosophy of SBOM. And I should say, with regards to SBOM, there are different versions of this in terms of the specification. We've got Cyclone DX being one, SPDX. They're all ultimately trying to solve similar goals and similar ambitions. But the provenance side of things for that is ultimately about having a trace of what has gotten brought into the system and by whom. So it kind of extends to having assurance about the integrity of the components, and trusting that it is what it says it is, that it comes from where it claims to have come, and it was written by who claims to have written it. There's some really, really interesting stuff happening in the provenance side of things at the moment. To call out names perhaps, but there's a very interesting project known as SigStore. It's backed by Google. A couple of other players like Red Hat are interested in this as well. And their approach to this has been ultimately that we have gotten to a point where our commercial software that we're building on a day-to-day basis relies increasingly upon untrusted, for the lack of a better phrase, open source components. And it opens up the exposure to various, bad actors within the system that can inflict harm through various ways. Introduction of vulnerabilities, and then obviously, actually acting upon them is another thing. So SigStore is a great example of something that's trying to combat that. And it's ultimately about creating a chain of trust between the author of a piece of code of open source, and then verifying that, once it gets the whole way through to an image, for example, that it is exactly what it was when it set out, and it's written by the same person. So the provenance trail ultimately describes that. And, for us in Cloudsmith, for example, we try to facilitate that through a whole bunch of different ways. We're talking about the concept of what we would say continuous packaging. And continuous packaging for us is essentially applying that whole concept of SBOM right the way through, from a developer writing code, pushing some code up to a Git repository, more than likely, and then kicking off a build process as a result of that. And the provenance trail for us, we feel, should effectively start from right at the beginning of that train and work right the way through to the end. And it's about having a catalog of events and being able to essentially trace an artifact that's come out at the south side that's been published perhaps to a customer or an internal system, and be able to piece together everything that happened in order to actually determine how it got there and by which actors were affecting it as well. So,
go ahead.
No, sorry, I was going to turn it around a little bit then in terms of, you'd mentioned about vulnerabilities and talking a little bit about that as well. And for us, we would see vulnerability. Obviously, vulnerabilities are an interesting one, because it starts to get into the discussion about what is acceptable risk in software. And it's tricky, because there will always, or will very much likely to be, vulnerabilities in almost every application that gets built today. Again, talking back to the bill of materials philosophy and how things are componentized into different pieces, and those can be individually exploited over time. And there's some very good and interesting ways in which people have tried to solve this. For example, the CVSS scoring system tries to put like a metric around. And I mean, most of your audience will 100% have understood this already, but for the 1% perhaps that are new to this, it's a great baseline to begin with, but it's obviously not the bread and butter. It can't be 100% relied upon. I think it depends on a fair bit of due diligence and understanding of the systems. It kind of acts as a factor, I would say, in terms of determining the risk factor of a vulnerability, but it shouldn't be the actual gospel. And
no, indeed, and I think you're getting to those points too. The CVSS does have those temporal environmental factors that can influence the score, but to build that type of context and understand how this score should adjust to the business context of the app, takes a little bit. It takes time to do, and that time is pretty. It is a scarce resource, both from the developer's perspective to say, well, how do we prioritize this? How many of these vulns do we really need to fix because they will be exploitable, versus how many can we not bother with, or can we accept for now and then put off and address at a later point? On the same vein, so with vulnerabilities, we're kind of talking about a bit of reactionary aspect. We build our catalog of software, we have our SBOMs that give us an idea of what we have, and then when a vuln gets announced or we identify one, we go out and fix it. But I'm curious, what are some additional ways that perhaps you've seen organizations be able to have some more proactive controls about protecting the dependencies that they're relying on? And here I'm starting to think about perhaps some of this aspect of provenance, things, attacks like typo squatting, things like that, or even just being able to say, how do we figure out, should we use a package in the first place, or which packages would be acceptable in the first place, setting aside even the presence of vulnerabilities?
Yeah, it's a great point. Certainly when it comes to 0 days at that stage, I'm not going to say game over, but you're in a very precarious situation at that point. And we as people within this industry should be doing everything that we can to help mitigate that from happening. And I mean, we've got a variety of tools out there to help facilitate that. The drum has been beaten on this show, and in many others, about shift left security, for a very long time, but for a very good reason. It's the right approach. It's about having that split of tooling for developers in the early stages of code being written, to understand the impact and the factors, and perhaps to have sort of procedures around even simple things like bringing in dependencies in the first place. Do we really need this particular dependency? What is my exposure by bringing this in? And I think the SBOM approach helps to inform that decision, but it is ultimately still a decision that needs to be made by organizations and development teams. But by utilizing tooling, I think across the whole spectrum, I don't think there's a silver bullet per se, but we have at our disposal, more tools than ever before. And SigStore is a good example of one I've just mentioned that helps sort of reduce the uncertainty in terms of open source components. But it isn't enough in isolation, I don't think. And I think we're probably, as engineers, going to have to start to think from security from the outset. It's not necessarily that we're going to completely deprecate security teams. I don't think that's ever going to happen. The concept of bringing security into the concept of engineering, it's a strong one, but it's time consuming, and as you've just mentioned, there's this nature of being proactive about it and having reporting, and it's probably not something that's going to fall within a developer's day to day. But use of SCA tooling, for example, in order to actually ascertain that what's being written in-house is less likely to introduce something, that's a start. Having assurances of where your application dependencies come from, that's obviously another super critical thing. To tie this back even to tooling, like for example, in Cloudsmith, we have a concept of bringing in upstream proxying, as we would call it. So allowing you to bring in your third-party dependencies. And you touched a little bit on sort of name squatting and typo squatting. And ultimately, that's the kind of thing that this aims to mitigate, in that, you have all of your client tooling pointing to the one source of truth, as it were. You've got your entire provenance trail going from start to finish throughout this one sort of single pane of glass. Again, not with the marketing words, but I think it actually sort of applies to this concept. But and in that case, if you're utilizing upstream proxying, for example, it's capable of going off to third-party repositories and doing the verification side of things, bringing things in, caching those dependencies and making them available as the list of the SBOM then for that particular application. And when we do this, I think it's probably a fairly good idea to even think about how these things can be structured, because ultimately we can. Historically, you've had like a Docker registry and perhaps a Maven repository and maybe a Python. Organizations use a whole host of different tools, and once you even start to get to the infrastructure side of things, it gets even more complicated because you have very similar processes that need to happen on the infrastructure side of things to try and avoid attacks. Great example would be Sentinel by HashiCorp that integrates with Terraform Cloud. It's a fantastic tool help you put policies in place to, perhaps avoid doing things like having unopened or wide open VPCs, for example. So I don't think to tie this all back, I don't think there's one size fits all solution here. But it's about being aware of everything from start to finish across that whole build and deploy pipeline, and being aware of the tooling and the strategies behind it to help us influence the design and development of those processes and ensure that things are better ultimately.
Indeed. And I think one of the aspects too that you're coming back to mention quite a lot is the tooling, even while acknowledging that these are processes. But in order to make those processes successful and in order to make them scale, you need to have the tool in them. And just that idea of like an upstream proxy is insane. Rather than having an AppSec person, throw an intern, say, you are now the approval person, and you have to look at every single, package dependency that's being pulled in and has to give it a thumbs up, thumbs down to approve. That's just honestly silly, because you'll burn someone out. It's not interesting work, but it's necessary work, and it's something that lends itself to automation. And it's very similar to the concept like in prod of blocking egress traffic. You don't want images to randomly initiate connections outbound unless you already know and understand what that destination is going to be. In this case, same thing with that type of proxy. Route the dependency manager or dependency checking through some centralized point that makes it easier to scale and inspect. So that's why, to me, it sounds like a successful path towards making this type of security possible, while still having maybe a presence of an AppSec team, but giving them more interesting things to work on, so they don't just necessarily have to go away. I'm curious too then on the aspect of some of the packages or rephrase it this way, you were touching on a lot of different tools, a lot of different aspects of the CI/CD pipeline. So if we do talk about some perhaps aspect of an approval process, and it could be an automated approval or it could be manual approval, what are some ways that you've seen DevOps teams and AppSec teams deploy this successfully, and mistakes perhaps that they have avoided, or mistakes perhaps more importantly for our listeners that they've learned from to figure out this is the healthy, constructive way to do such approval versus the way that's going to burn everybody out and not really get us where we want to be in terms of secure software? Sure.
No, that's a good point. If we tie things back a little bit, even to talk about the concept of proxying upstream, I think one of the issues that you really have whenever it comes to think about things like name squatting is the fear that that someone, and this is obviously a very well worded topic. It's out there on the web. Check it out. Google it if you've not come across it before. But utilizing an upstream proxy alone will help mitigate that. It's as simple as, and you're absolutely right. You 100% will still need AppSec teams. That's not going to change overnight. The tooling is getting better. But in terms of actually sort of talking about automating improvement or automating roll-ins of let's give vulnerabilities, for example, it's probably not an overnight thing. I would say we're probably still going to need some kind of manual intervention on that. It's interesting because from a personal perspective, the concept of automating security scares me a little bit. And then there's obviously different levels of this as to where it can. What's okay and what's not. I mean, if we were to talk about vulnerabilities and whether or not something affects it, there's obviously a point at which we have to look at something in isolation and go, well, is this actually in a critical path of code that we actually use? Is it dead code or something along those lines? So the point being that there's a thought process involved in that, and so to do automation on that is quite tricky. And we've seen. Customers, certainly I've seen customers that have attempted to do it, and some with some success, but there's certain edge cases and you ultimately end up duplicating a lot of the work in order to do it. I think the approval process is still incredibly important across the board. If we think about a great example of how we tend to ask or sort of give advice to our customers to do this would be, take a repository and have it represent an environment. So have like a staging environment, for example. So a whole repository that represents staging, and another repository that represents production. And then we would ultimately talk about the approval process of gating things from A to B as it progresses through the pipeline. And I think possibly utilizing some tooling to prompt people to do investigations on things is probably super critical and super important. And again, it varies, right? Application dependencies, we could go the whole way through and start talking about things like Dependabot and alternatives, things like that. People have in practice, merged those sorts of things into code, and providing that the acceptance tests pass, that's probably okay. But I think I guess what I'm trying to say is it's probably quite context sensitive, depending on the nature of what it is that you're trying to change. Essentially, if it's a small upstream dependency that's being brought in, and you're capable of engineering your processes in such a manner that you're able to perform succinct end-to-end testing, for example, prior to the promotion into production, then that's great. But I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution for it, and definitely I think it relies on a fine balance of developers' time and AppSec teams' time as well.
Yeah, it brings up the famous threat modeling phrase that begins, well, it depends. The business context is important. A lot of what we've been talking about, too, is as consumers of an SBOM. We're relying on an SBOM to have been generated so we can use it for many of these decision processes that you've been describing, so that developers AppSec team can have those informed discussions and figure out how we can prioritize, have our different repos represent staging the A to B to C transition. Which all of that makes a lot of sense. I want to turn it around, though, in the sense of what about organizations that need to generate SBOMs? Are there different steps? Are there things that you would recommend, whether it's something like choosing Cyclone DX or some other different type of SBOM format, so that they can produce SBOMs for others to be consumed?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think ultimately, like the concept of an SBOM is probably there to provide certainty of makeup and conformance and all that good stuff. You're right. We've talked at length about the consumer of someone that's doing that. As a producer, I think it helps to credentialize more than anything else. I mean, we've all within the industry, we've all worked with vendors and partners over the years, and you get endless amounts of security questionnaires. There are security certifications such as ISO 27001 in terms of your process improvements, SOC 2, for example, as well. And they're great and very, very important. And they very much are there in order to have a certain level of certainty about the business processes. I think being able to produce an SBOM upon request for your product, it's that extra sort of stamp, if you will, that extra seal of approval. It gives assurance to your customers for sure. And in terms of the process, you're right. There's Cyclone DX, there's SPDX. I guess depending on how things have been structured, it should be a relatively painless process. I say should be. It's probably not, But these things ultimately give assurance to everyone across the line. And as a consumer of software, if an organization could present this to me, it gives incredible clarity in terms of the actual effort that business is putting into security. And obviously, something that's very, very critical and very important to them. And it just strengthens the perception ultimately as well. But perception stuff aside, as a user of that, it's important. And we talk about SBOMs in terms of software bill of materials, but we could go on in terms of bills of materials. There's talk now of SaaS bombs as well. I'm not sure if you probably have come across this as a concept, but very similar sorts of things. What SaaS products do you use in order to actually produce the product that comes out at the end of your pipeline? And again, that type of information can be useful because it's nice to know that your exposure, if you're relying upon a SaaS, for example, where are the weak points in this application's security infrastructure? Is it within AWS? Are they relying on an independent CDN like Fastly or something? And having that information, it's all just about transparency and provenance and about giving that information out to people. I think irrespective of what end of the spectrum you're on, it's an incredibly useful piece of information, and one I think most of us should really be vying to get essentially from our services.
Yeah, you're basically, pulling what is it, raising the curtain. I'm looking for like a Wizard of Oz perhaps metaphor here, but just showing that there's a lot of complexity behind software being delivered. There are the small bits of here's just a one self-contained NPM package that might have a cascading link of 20 more packages on it, or something that is a more complex, like you were just saying, SaaS, and here's CDNs behind it, here's other providers, here's the other CDNs that were just involved in developing this, and any one of them could have potentially introduced a vulnerability or introduced a weakness. So that's pretty interesting. It's just in the sense of showing we're all basically, maybe it's the idea that AppSec is a team sport, and we're broadening with SBOM the size of the teams, perhaps that we realize are playing this game. And I don't know exactly where I'm going with that, other than building up metaphors. So let's get off the metaphor aspect and to another question in the sense of you spent quite a bit of time looking at SBOMs. You've given us some great ideas, both as consumers, producers of SBOMs, what they can help with. In other words, how to position them within your threat model or within your processing. Is there something that you would love to see SBOMs also adopt? Because I think we're still in the early days, we're perhaps in the late days of understanding the problem, but probably in the early days of actually getting to a solution. So is there something that still hasn't been pulled into the SBOM umbrella, so to speak, that you would love to see, or something else that how you would love to just see the SBOMs represent information or just make themselves be easier to be consumed? Yeah,
no, absolutely. I think we're starting to get to a defined standard for good or for bad. And, I'm not sure if any of your audience have seen the XKCD comic of standards, 17 standards, there's now, that sort of thing. But yeah. I think standardization is obviously a first step, and we try to come to some sort of consensus over what makes sense. But in terms of the features of what's in those SBOMs and also, I guess, the usefulness of them, I personally would like to see more adoption in, native tooling, for example, that's used within the various different programming language environments. So if it was capable of generation of SBOM, for example, for within, if I happen to be a .NET developer, perhaps the NuGet client, or Maven, for example, is another one. There are plugins that can do this sort of thing in Maven, but I think it would be fantastic if we could start to see some of this adoption across the whole sort of flow of all the various tool chains that people tend to use day in, day out within, the application and application security world. And it can complement each other and ultimately try and lift some of the burden of that stuff away, and make it almost table stakes, I guess. But the interactions, the integrations of that then, and the usefulness of that information, I think, perhaps being able to take that stuff and present it in some way in terms of observability pipelines. So, the Datadogs of the world, the New Relics, whatever it happens to be in your organization, trying to get that information into a presentable way where you're able to react upon changes for negative, for good or for bad. So if something was brought in that was disallowed, shouldn't happen with the tooling, it is there to prevent it, but just in case, and in terms of reporting and the simplification of all of that stuff. I guess if you look at the specs of these things and get an idea of what it's capable, you're able to talk about things at a component level, and you're able to talk about files, and that's quite good. We were able to talk about licensing. That's great. We were able to talk about operating system interoperability. There's a whole bunch of stuff there, but I think the spec, you're right in the sense that it's early days, and we're going to see as time evolves, we're going to start to see more of an influence of all of the various stakeholders of the different standards committees that are producing these things. But from a kind of from my own personal standpoint, I would love to see organizations tooling just adopt it so that it is a standard, so that I can put this thing into things and actually see it, that my client tooling, that a developer who's maybe never had to think about this before is capable of just running something on like a Docker command line or something and getting that information out. I think that would be great if we can get to that point in the future.
I think it would be great. And I think just kudos to you for every answer you've managed to bring in an aspect of automation tooling to make things easier. So, and that really speaks to me as someone who not necessarily lazy, but likes to be efficient, so to speak, or slightly less, making the joke. It's just, I think it's going to be a way to make that scalable. So bringing this into the IDEs, bringing this into Golang, for example, or other aspects that are creating sort of these statically compiled aspects, that statically compiled binaries are a lot harder to introspect, to figure out what version of OpenSSL did it pull in. Was it a vulnerable version, not vulnerable version? So I can see there SBOMs that are part of the compiler process can really help us out. So I think that's a great message for you to bring with us, Tom. And I think throughout this whole segment, you've brought us a lot of great messages. And I want to thank you for that.
No, thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here. Very happy to talk. I could talk at lengths about this stuff, as you can probably tell. So, yeah.
Indeed, and we'll definitely have to talk with you more about your background too. And by background, I mean the fabulous amount of Legos that are on those shelves, as well as on the theme of observability. You've got a nice telescope back there as well. So lots of fun things within the application security that I'm sure we could bring in metaphors to SBOM.
Yeah, probably too many.
Probably too many, which probably means we need to let you go for that 501st home improvement project. But thanks again, Tom, for joining us. Thanks, John, as well. For all of you hanging out with us and listening, if you'd like to learn more about Cloudsmith, visit securityweekly.com/Cloudsmith. And with that, we're going to take a quick break and reanimate with news of the week.
Software supply chain attacks are continuing to expose vulnerabilities in organizations around the world. The time has come to focus your efforts on security for your software packages. Cloudsmith is the only cloud-native software package management solution for your enterprise. With Cloudsmith Continuous Packaging, you can securely deliver software across the globe and mitigate potential threats from entering your supply chain. With over 23 plus formats supported, Cloudsmith is the solution that engineers choose to safely deliver all of their assets. Reduce unneeded downtime and deliver with confidence. Start securing your software supply chain today by visiting securityweekly.com/Cloudsmith. Contrast Security enables organizations to secure their applications from development to production. By embedding security sensors within software, Contrast automatically and continuously detects vulnerabilities in both custom and open source code while developers write code, providing them with context-specific how-to-fix guidance for easy and fast remediation. At the same time, by identifying only true vulnerabilities that pose risk and eliminating those that do not, Contrast empowers developers and security teams to prioritize and focus on only those vulnerabilities that matter. Learn how Contrast can help you secure your applications from development through production at securityweekly.com/Contrast. Looking to improve your web application security? Probly is reinventing web application security. Probly focuses on the vulnerabilities that matter, eliminates false positives with evidence-based scanning, and provides a simple point-and-shoot solution that is easy to use. Probly's thorough coverage ensures accurate identification of vulnerabilities in any modern web application or API. Improve your web application security processes by visiting securityweekly.com/Probly and start your free trial today.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by John Kinsella. InfoSec World 2021 is proud to announce its keynote lineup for this year's event. Hear from Robert Herjavec, plus heads of security at the NFL, TikTok, U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Stanford University, and more. Plus, Security Weekly listeners save 20% on digital pass registration. Visit securityweekly.com/ISW2021 to register now. Then you can also join us October 21st to learn why zero-knowledge encryption matters. Plus, if you missed any of our previously recorded webcasts or technical trainings, they are available for your viewing pleasure at securityweekly.com/on-demand. Oh, news of the week. And John, I know you've got an article yourself, and there's some others to get through, but there's one in particular that I'm excited about because I believe it was Shakespeare who wrote 2E or .2E. That is regression. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to encode the dots and slashes of outrageous input or normalize against a sea of trouble. And with that, my iambic pentameter is done for the day. And yes, Apache has a directory traversal in it, and that was pretty exciting. But I stole all the thunder from that one. So anything, help us with this path traversal. What stood out to it about it to you?
Nah, you're good. I'm just pulling up. I was looking at the code on my laptop last week. And what's interesting about this one is I don't have them on my main machine, unfortunately. Because when this came out, we all know you love this type of vulnerability. So I had to go dig in, because I know we'd be talking about it on air. And so I started looking at the actual pull request and for the patch. And it's not nearly as clear as you'd expect it would be. Mm-hmm. Right, it's a pretty nitty gritty, and partially because this is C, right? Yeah, it must be. It's HTTPD. I had to think for a second because Apache has so much Java, but yeah. So it's not like just it's interesting to go back and look at the patch. Maybe I'll throw it into Discord, see if I can copy between my machines here. But it's just complex enough that it's not just a simple cleaning up or anything. It's there's a decent bit of logic in there that had to make sure to get this right. And I'm not sure, honestly, if this is the first patch or the second. So I might have to double check that. But yeah, this was a tricky one. And this is a package which has been around for ages. And sort of the backstory on this for folks who aren't fully up to date. This was the result of I'll put air quotes improvement that they came in. I don't know if you know the timing, Mike. It was sometime in the last year, and then they realized that that wasn't quite as tight as we thought it was. The new code, so they had to go back and do this. My understanding is this is being scanned for out in the real world. So patch now, patch often.
Patch now, patch often. Yeah, and it does hit some of the common themes that they had to release a patch for the patch because the original fix wasn't quite right. What are some good mitigating circumstances around this is that, yes, it is a pretty gnarly vulnerability, but everyone wasn't necessarily exposed to this by default. It's more if you're running these cPanel type of applications that are sort of for managing, web-based management of an infrastructure environment. So still pretty bad, but not a sky is falling type of bad. But I'm glad you were looking into the source code. That's because that's one of those things that I often recommend or try to look at myself too, is just to see what does this patch look like in trying to learn from what people are doing to fix things. And that learning is in the sense of, was this just as simple as a human mistake where it was the sense of a logic comparison was off, so there's a single bit flip or something like that. But this did have some subtle changes to it. And one of the things that stood out to me is kind of a nice aspect is they also deprecated a flag as part of this fix. It's sort of that they don't need it anymore. And the reason I like that is that for as much as there is, benefit and need to write more code, add more code, expand systems, applications like Apache HTTPD, there's also a great security benefit to deleting code or deprecating code as well. And so anytime you can delete code, fingers crossed, are reducing your attack surface and making a security improvement just in that manner as well, so that these logic flows can be perhaps more, or hopefully more understandable for humans that are reading them, or even potentially less complex for the automated tools trying to walk through the AST and understand what is the path from this tainted input down to a sink where this might be an exploitable vuln. So some interesting, I think at least, some interesting kind of tidbits there about the, this is a path reversal, fun thing, but some good points to talk about, I hope.
Yeah, and it's funny. It's you make me think the way you describe that. There's something when, as a developer, when I get to actually delete some of my code because it's no longer being used, either because I found a more elegant way, or if a feature's not needed, or usually one of the reasons why we delete code, it can be a little bit nerve-wracking, but also at the same time, there's often a sense of not satisfaction, but I guess I'll use that phrase for now. But like you've actually, as a developer, frequently we like that. We want to make things cleaner and more elegant, and hopefully not to have all these sort of nitty gritty if tests to make sure we're secure.
Right.
So it's a nice thing if we can deprecate something and initially sort of let's just put a feature flag test on it or something like that to sort of make it there but not being used for now, and then when you actually get to finally remove it. So it's a wonderful thing to do when we can. So I agree with what you're saying is what I'm trying to say.
That does set up, I think, a good segue. We have a bunch of articles, but I did pull in an article about Microsoft disabling Excel 4.0 macros by default. And this one is the AppSec connection is not so much here are macros that have existed since 1992. So, this is we're talking, the first Matrix era, a movie time in the world here, before the first Matrix even, and Microsoft finally came about and disabled these macros by default because they've been a massive attack surface, and lots of attackers apparently in 2021 have been targeting it. But I wanted to pull this in less just because it's a Microsoft aspect, but kind of to continue what you were talking about there just now, John, is when you look at your code, when do you make those decisions about something should be a disable by default so that we can get that sense of secure by default? And here I'm kind of thinking of Kubernetes. Let's have some more just secured configurations by default so we can avoid these 50 pages of deploy secure by do this, and this. So there's secure by default, but then there's a deprecation line, and then you can also just remove a feature. But clearly there's a tension, especially if a feature can stick around for 30 years, a tension between the business reasons or the business context, we need this, it must remain, versus that's terribly insecure, architectures have changed, our design patterns have changed, let's just get rid of it. So throwing this out maybe just more as a thought exercise, perhaps as well for our listeners, but a thought exercise for you, John, since I know that you and I have, some different sort of perspectives on refactor all the time versus, no, we actually have a business to run and, we need to make some money.
There was, I'm going to sidetrack on that for a second. A friend on LinkedIn last week from a different Slack, I'm on a CTO Slack. If I can find his name real quick, I'll throw out a great, Mark Batty wrote a post. I think he's quoting someone else talking about developing software development from a point of view of you don't want you're not trying to get to the pageant award-winning baby. You want an ugly baby, right? You need something that it's a baby. It's got the arms and legs and everything, and it's you're working on getting something that will get you shipping product and those type of things. It falls apart a little bit, I know. I went a little bit further and said, you want to make, and I'm going to clean up my language for general consumption. But you want to make sure that you're still having that baby for the right reasons, not to make sure someone loves you and stays married to you. So, but yeah, that point being, agreeing with what you just said there. But going back to the this article, what caught my eye, the visual me, is if you look in when the attacks, I mean, this, as you said, it's been around for forever, but it's really the last few years that the attacks have really started picking up on it. They have like a graph of attack frequency, and I thought that was really interesting. That I guess probably as the malcreants out there sort of they stopped having other things they were interested in or that were easily vulnerable for them to use. They're like, okay, what's next? Hey, how about this thing that's been around for forever? Let's go back and try that again. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see. I'm not sure what percentage of people are actually still using this in some degree. Mm-hmm. So hopefully you didn't leave too many people behind when they did this. There's not too much teeth chattering. But yeah, I think it's a good idea that they put this one to bed.
Yeah, and I think with an optimistic hat on, in addition to my Doctor Who hat, I like to think too that an uptick in targeting this type of ancient software and less secure architecture, less secure design is a reflection that the modern software of the web browsers, the other business software, those actually have been hardened to a point that clearly we still have 0 days, we still have vulnerabilities, but they're not so pervasive and perhaps they're just patched that much more easily that it is forcing the attacker costs to look for these older tried and true methods, which for that matter, regardless of all of the software improvements, compiler improvements we can do, if we're still going to lose credentials, stolen credentials are one of the easiest ways to access a system, which is also why one of the reasons I'm mentioning FIDO keys every single episode so far in October. And I think it also gives us a segue into the Twitch security incident. So here was not a software problem in the sense of memory safety or a cross-site scripting or some type of injection attack, but apparently a misconfiguration. Now, unfortunately, I would love to know what the specific misconfiguration was, whether it was something cloud-based or a particular appliance. But whatever this configuration change was, allowed an attacker into the Twitch environment, and they extracted lots of data, lots of interesting things. And here we haven't talked about breaches in quite a while, and I wanted to make two sort of AppSec ties about this one. One is that there's business impact for breaches. When we talk about the OWASP top 10, we talk about threat modeling. I really want to harp on the idea that let's make sure we pull in the business context. That's a lot of what Tom was just describing too in the last segment. And here the business context is, gamer payouts for what are the top 100 or so streamers on Twitch. And that's sensitive information, especially for those streamers. Of course, it has implications for Twitch as well, but there's people involved in the consequences of poor security, and that's what I wanted to hit on. And then just the other aspect too, from since there was source code leaked here, I'm going to be very curious to see how many people are getting a copy of the source code, running their own SaaS scanners against it, their own SEP reps and linters, and they're going to start populating the Twitch bug bounty with, oh, by the way, I just happen to have known that there is a vulnerability here in your code. Throw me some bug bounty bucks. So don't have anything to necessarily prove that that's going to happen, but just a bit of curiosity in the sense of there's code out there now.
Sorry, I was trying to Google something really quickly. Do they have a bug? Yeah, they're on HackerOne. Let me think. Yeah, so this was, so this is interesting. I think that the post we have here is sort of making it look not as bad as we all know it is. But what was interesting to me about this when it first came out, I really didn't look and watch this one closely. I'm like, okay, whatever. Beside the fact that we, both you and I, Mike, we need to work on becoming the top application security streamers on Twitch. The
Amen to that.
thing that people need to think about is it sort of comes back to supply chain in a way. Either from a SaaS point of view or even source code or any of these sort of things, that just because a company like Amazon has a well-respected, well-known, I will say, security stance, that doesn't mean that all their children companies or all their projects have that same level of quality. There's other orgs out there, I'm not going to mention names, I know they've got very well-respected, very top-end, extremely well-secured applications. But that same org has, the other parts which have that aren't making as much money. This isn't something we usually talk about on a podcast, so someone completely else. But there's other packages which they have, which haven't been updated for a few years, or only have like 2 developers working on them. And man, that thing, when you point the scanner at it, is Swiss cheese. So this is sort of that same type of thing. It's like, okay, it's interesting. The average person who's using Twitch, this is a good one actually. The average person who's a Twitch user, how much are they thinking about security of the application when they signed up for Twitch or when they're using it day in, day out? Even those guys that are at the top payers, whatever they're being paid, were they thinking, did they ever consider that there's a chance that their earnings might get leaked out? And this is sort of the interesting aspect of really a consumer product, right? A lot of what we do, we focus around enterprise security to a pretty good degree, because that's where, unfortunately, usually where the money is. I've been having a lot of interesting conversations with the VCs about that recently, but that's sort of part of it, right? We usually don't think too much about security of consumer or SMB or SME. So here's a pretty good example of what happens when you don't focus on that for that sort of corner of the market. And the counter for those who are playing along at home that haven't had these fun discussions with the VCs usually look at startups that are enterprise security space, because enterprises are known to pay for security because of, they're making money off it. They want to be able to sell to other enterprises, all these type of things. If you're trying to make a security product that's going to be sold to a consumer company, say like, say you're doing security for fashion designers that are going to sell clothing online, you're going to have a much harder time doing a raise on that, because the VCs think that the clothing sites aren't going to be as interested in paying money for that. And that's sort of part of the, this space we're in, just enterprise, security and weekly. I mean, it's hard for me even not say enterprise security like I just did. But that's sort of the interesting takes of this. Everyone needs application security. We all need to think about this, from the IoT stuff we talk about up to things like this. So how do we help push that out?
Well, John, you can help push this out by us. Roll up a D&D character, and since we're going to start doing a hybrid Dungeons and Dragons application security weekly Twitch streaming, and that will get us out into that top 100 for sure. But I think you are making good points, and I think those points that you're making we can tie into the SaaS bomb that Tom did mention, and you very quickly and helpfully pulled in an article on that. And real quick, my first impression of that, the idea of a SaaS bomb is, I just want to know, does the SaaS offer SSO, and are we using it as an organization, as a consumer of this SaaS? Now, there are obviously some other very important aspects about how is code being built, what is being packaged, what service is being delivered, but just that SSO part, if we could solve that for an organization to say, how many third-party, how many SaaS apps are we using? How many of them are onboarded to SSO? The two simple questions, often hard to answer, especially as you get into, I was going to say especially as you get into larger, more complex organizations, but I'm going to suspect that even small organizations, and here I'm thinking of, 20 to 30 person shops, possibly rely quite a bit on SaaS because that's a great way to amplify and improve your productivity in a lot of different areas. So the SSO is, I have to get beyond just the SSO aspect. So help pull me into some other interesting parts of this SaaS bomb, John.
That's one of the more important aspects of this from a, basic sort of low hanging fruit we should be on knockoff. This isn't quite as strong as I was hoping for. So I think what got me excited to go and track this down when we were talking about in the last episode is, I think 2 weeks ago, I was saying, hey, we need to have this for the SaaS providers, for them to tell us. So that's what I was really excited and hoping this would be at first. I think this is more geared towards, I'm a company, I consume a bunch of SaaS products. I need that to be a part of my SBOM, which I'm able to share wherever I'm going to share it, either internally for security practices, or if I'm going to have this exposed to one of my partners, either I'm working with in one way or another. And what's interesting, there was a sentence in here, I'm not going to find it right now, but what really sort of struck me was they were saying part of the reason they came up with this, SaaS bomb, is that the bombs which we have right now, which we've been talking about, again, last episode and out and about, but the CyberDX, as well as, I can't remember the other one right now, but, the 2 or 3 different standards we have for this, those are really focused on software and their dependencies, but the scope of those frameworks hasn't been, I'll say loose enough. It hasn't been flexible enough to be able to bring in, some sort of service that you're using for something, not so much that you're linking in or compiling it, but something that you are making an API call out to or something like that. So I think this is going to help cover that. But still, I'd love to see, let's go a step further and have some of these cloud providers actually sort of somehow expose what they're doing when they're using something which hasn't been written internal. I'm not sure how much more work that's going to take, but that's really the direction I'm hoping to see over the next 18, 24 months.
Definitely a lot of work, I'm going to suspect. And I'm going to use that as a chance to pull in another article that, I read through, I looked at it, the open source project that it is referring to, but I haven't had a good chance yet to understand it fully. So without further ado, let me introduce this other article about microservices adoption and the software supply chain. So once again, perhaps not the most exciting title, but it's talking about supply chain issues, the ones that we were talking about with Tom, some of the difficult aspects that you were pointing out just now, John, as well, was with SaaS, and what should they what steps do they need to take, or how long will it take to go through all those steps? So this one kind of caught my eye because it's an open source project, but sponsored by a new startup that's basically about the idea of building an AST, and then rather than throwing some static analysis against that AST to find known vulnerabilities, things like that, basically say, let's manipulate it and do some refactoring at scale. So there's definitely, this isn't necessarily a new concept, but it's pretty cool to see the concepts start to be approached at scale, to use our second cliche of the episode. But in the sense that if you do have a huge mono repos, or you have a huge code base and you have to update a whole bunch of packages, updating those packages can be pretty tedious from a manual perspective. Same thing goes if you are using Terraform or particular Kubernetes configurations, and you want to enable something that is secure by default, rather than manually have to go to flick on all of these switches to say, yep, now we're enforcing this. If you could do this automatically with a tool like this Open Rewrite, there's potentially an appeal to there. And the reason I threw that little caveat, time you are making code changes, some bad things can happen if you don't have good test suites, or you don't have good regression testing, or good, just even unit testing for that matter. So I see some promise here, and I would just be curious if anyone out there has actually done any real large amounts of automated code refactoring, other than the large Googles out there that I know have done this in a few cases. So Thought it was interesting. Not sure if it has a similar appeal to you, or if it's sort of like, let's just wait and see, and what might be, what might the future hold for this type of approach.
Yeah, it's definitely appealing to me. And very full disclosure, I actually have a small position in the parent company Modern from AngelList Investment. So it's nothing major, but as soon as I saw it, I'm like, yeah, these guys are doing something cool. I haven't got a chance to use Open Rewrite. I have watched it multiple times and sort of been looking at it, looking for an excuse almost. But they've been gaining steam over the last year. I think it's been open sourced about that. So it might be sort of fun to try and grab those guys at some point and bring them on here. They're based in San Francisco, so that could be sort of fun to talk a little bit deeper about what they're up to.
Yeah, definitely would be fun to talk more. And wonderful that you've got that connection. AppSec, InfoSec is a small world after all. Speaking of small worlds, I had some kind of small topic articles here. One was just about NSA warns of alpaca attack and the use of wildcard certs. And that one was just, I pulled that in because we did mention alpaca earlier this year, I think back in one of our June 2021 episodes. Kind of interesting just to say vulnerabilities in TLS, configurations, mismatches that TLS is in other places besides HTTPD, besides web servers. That's kind of the gist of just where I'm going with there. But here I wanted to pull in a little bit of the aspect of the wildcard cert, and my mind went into sort of that idea of a lesson learned in the sense of, for the longest time, InfoSec community was like, use HTTPS. We're going to shame you into using HTTPS. And then finally somebody like Let's Encrypt came along and said, well, rather than just telling people what they should be doing and pointing out the problem over and over again, why don't we try solving it? And Let's Encrypt solved it by making it possible to obtain certs for free. So addressing the one budget aspect, as well as introducing like the Acme protocol so that the ongoing maintenance of certificates could be managed, because that's also one of the harder parts. And here, the wildcard certificates are often more expensive certificates, but they were also kind of addressing a ease of use, if you will, for organizations that have tons of domains, because maybe they have domains that can be arbitrarily created for user-generated content, that sort of thing. And now we get in that sudden tension of incentives between, let's have a wildcard cert because we have all these complex user-generated domain names, but that wildcard cert, if it's compromised, if it's leaked, if it's lost, could be pretty consequential. And it is nice to see, an encouragement to move away from there. So that was sort of my attempt to pull in, a broader thought around this type of article. So I'm not sure if there's anything more there for you, John, or if we could go into our last one and think about cybersecurity programs.
I think I would actually go as far as to say, I think, 12 to 18 months, I guess that's where my brain is today. But within that 12 to 18 month window, let's just get rid of wildcard certs. I think Acme's been around for a few years now. Most of us know Let's Encrypt had some issues last week, and they sort of caused a lot of pain and teeth gnashing for people. But that's we can talk about that. Well, let's talk about it. So I don't think we covered it. Let's Encrypt had a root certificate change, if I remember right. They gave a pretty good amount of heads up. As with most things TLS, people weren't watching. So when the root certificate actually flipped, people were caught, let's say, red-handed, and their domains went offline for a little bit. So they, ran around hair and fire and got that fixed. And that's the problem with something like Let's Encrypt. You have to know it really well. You have to watch it very well. Otherwise, you will get bitten. And I've been bitten in the past. But all that said, once you know all these things, and maybe we need a better way, maybe they need to come up with now that they've got Let's Encrypt done itself, they need a better way to monitor and notify and let people know what's going on with them. Those certs with the system. But you have the ability to generate a TLS cert that easily. Why would you need a wildcard?
Yes.
So if we don't need it, let's goodbye. And one last closing point on that. Every time I see an alpaca attack, I wish there was a fuzzing angle in here, because you could say fuzzy alpaca or something, but I'm reaching.
Keep on reaching. We need to see some more wonderfully named vulnerabilities with warm and cuddly mascots for sure. And you set up a good segue, I think, because the idea that we shouldn't need wildcards anymore, because as you described, the processes to obtain certs for SNIs and whatnot is that it's so much easier and of course cheaper, especially when cheaper can be zero in terms of the cost of purchasing, not necessarily the cost of maintenance, but again, Acme Protocol, let's encrypt as your friend. And this ties into another article from Phil Venables. So this is the second time we've grabbed an article of his, and this definitely goes into the think piece article that has none of the negative connotations of think pieces and more of, oh, this is a good things to think about. And what stood out to me were numbers 5 and 7. So these are he has a list of good properties of a cybersecurity program. Number 5 was a strategic architecture, and number 7 was preventative maintenance. So strategic architecture is very much the idea of the modern movement towards zero trust. There's even, he doesn't use the words, zero prod or zero trust in prod. I can't remember what the fancy term is for that. But the idea of shifting left, moving attestation and authentication onto peer-to-peer discussions conversations between devices as opposed to network-based security. And then number 7, that preventative maintenance, that's the idea of, get rid of your tech debt. Let's review. Maybe we should have deprecated those XML 4.0 macros quite a long time ago. Or let's revisit, why do we have these wildcard certs? Is there something that has changed in our ecosystem that actually gives us better processes, better architecture, better design pattern, that we can actually replace this altogether with something that is new and improved? And hopefully my excitement, my enthusiasm for this is coming across, because I think that this is a really good thing to point to, in the sense of, we're not deploying a tool to look for vulnerabilities. We're actually doing some work to get rid of the potential for vulnerabilities in the first place. So that's why I got excited about this article. Tell us more about this, John. What when you look at this, what stands out for you?
I think I'll pick out my 2 favorite, which I think would be number 1 and number 6. So accountable executive. And this sounds, really, I don't want to say cliche, but it sounds like we know about that. But I think a lot of the folks out there that are doing AppSec or that are trying to do AppSec, you'll have a CTO or some sort of a C-level type person. They're like, do we really need to be spending this much time on this, or can we just get that code out? And that will, I believe the technical phrase is, bite you in the ass. So you have to have the exec team, that exec board, the exec team and the board, particularly the board, need to understand, we're doing this for a reason. We're not over engineering. We're not being perfectionists. We're not, doing all those things which engineers get blamed for. We care, and we actually want to, within reason, put a little bit of effort into making sure that we don't end up like Twitch. And I'm just using them as an example. I'm not poking fun at them purposely. And then number 6 is sort of the second part of that, transparency. And it's not just, to me, I don't think it's so much transparency itself. I think what you get if you have a culture of transparency is you have a little more mature thinking. You have a little less, let's shove things underneath the carpet. It's, hey, we need to talk about this. So if we're going to talk about this, what do we need to do to actually prepare and actually have not just a good story, but let's get our stuff right. And so I think that's, the multiple of these are good points, right? Let's go over 1 or 2 others just for the giggles. The architecture, I think you mentioned, is super useful. Independent challenge is sort of interesting. I mean, I think what's interesting also when I started to look over these the first time sort of really quickly is a lot of them sort of feel like something from either an ISO 27001 or from, what's our US guy? We were just talking about it last hour. SOC 2. Yeah. So I think a lot of these type of things we see as we go into regulated markets, which more and more of us are becoming, but it's still a good thing to be talking about and thinking about.
Indeed. And I think those regulated markets are good forcing functions for just maturing the processes. And I wanted to emphasize that because none of what we're saying has been implying or trying to imply that you've got your ISO certification or you've got your SOC 2 secure, but it should mean that you have the processes in place that leads to better security practices that can translate into more secure software, or also better responses when there is a breach or when there is a problem in your, piece of software. And I'm kind of hoping to tie this into our SBOM discussion, that SBOM also has some of that aspect of that forcing function just to mature the processes, even if it's as simple as your, shift left, we'll say, or securing the SDLC. And yes, as you said too, hopefully we'll continue to see more transparency in that following Twitch, topical this week, of course, for the breach, but we'll see more transparency about the reporting, about what came out of that, so others can also avoid similar mistakes or understand just what server misconfigurations can come to bite people and avoid them. So I think that exhausts my my thought on articles for the week. And any parting thoughts for our listeners, John?
Ooh, parting thoughts. Secure your stuff. I was looking at one more. We didn't get into the news here, but I think we got a few seconds, so I'll talk about it. Coinbase had a 6,000 user accounts at least partially compromised due to how their 2FA was set up. And I'll add this into Discord here in a second. Do a little copy paste thing. But the point being, bringing this up, and we've seen this thing before, having and we're actually just talking about multi-factor authentication tokens on there earlier in Discord. But having this type of stuff by itself isn't enough, right? It's how do you actually do it correctly? How do you make sure everything's set up right? And it seems like we've got some laws coming into place which will allow the spamming on SMS and the takeover of not your SMS key, the card in your phone. That'll be a little bit more difficult to do, account takeovers. But still, SMS's 2FA needs to go away, I think, personally. But if you're going to use it, be very careful on how you do. And I think probably my takeaway from the day, as I wrap back to that, would be research, right? You can't just pick something and use it, but actually think about what are the security ramifications of this. Is it secure by default? Do I need to be doing it a different way? Have we been seeing people get attacked through this? How could someone attack it? Can I, now that I've thought about that, how do I secure that? So that's my moment of Zen for today.
Excellent moment of Zen. And thank you to everyone in the Discord. Also pointing out, Google's rolling out or distributing FIDO keys to some of its highly at-risk users. And so just to kind of emphasize what John was saying, the FIDO keys are a great counter to account takeovers, but they're introducing other considerations that you have to take in the sense of, how do you do account recovery once you do have a FIDO key? Because those little bits of hardware, easy to lose, easy to get messed up. And once you're locked out, you need to have a good, and at least equally secure mechanism of account recovery that doesn't fall into a much more insecure process that's then once again easily compromised that could lead to account takeover. So October is Halloween Horror Month. Go get your FIDO key, protect your accounts. That's the message. The other message is, thank you for joining us. Thank you, John, as well. And we're going to go make up our D&D characters and get ready for some Twitch streaming as well. Let's see when we can kick that off. We'll return next week in a spine-chilling sequel to Application Security Weekly.